led companies through IPO twice. He's a proven investor for more than 70 companies, has achieved 3.6 times return and $1 billion basically on basically the $410 million invested. He's an HBA and MBA graduate of Ivy Business School at Western University, and he has represented Canada on the world stage in many speeches around the world that he does. He co-founded the C100, a network of influential Canadians in Silicon Valley, and right now he moved to Canada to lead Community Tech as president and CEO. So Chris, very impressive. I'd like you to add more in this basically background and resume. Hopefully I didn't miss important part of your background. Welcome, and please let us know a little bit more about you.
Well, Ilya, can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Fabulous. So first of all, just really wanted to thank GIMI for the opportunity to address the group. I've had an opportunity to watch some of your other sessions and was just kind of blown away by the talent and the perspectives that this community has been able to pull together. So just really thrilled to be with you. I guess you could kind of put my life into 3 quick chapters, if you will. So I'm 5-time founder. So I had 2 startups in Canada, 1 in Russia and 2 down in Silicon Valley. Was very fortunate. 2 of those companies got quite large, took them public and sort of $10 billion plus companies. 1 was in the first internet wave. So unlike Al Gore, I actually had a company that actually built the global internet, a company called Newbridge Networks, and installed data communications equipment around the world, everywhere from China, throughout Europe and South America and a big chunk of Africa. Then we had another company that apparently I should have called Cloud, but it was a global low latency company that built all of E-Trade's network, so that we could do real-time trading. So I've been through a couple of big waves: the building of the internet, the building of cloud computing as an operator, and then a second chapter was as an investor, as you mentioned, and really thrilled to have been able to invest in transformational companies in the last big wave around mobile, companies that came out of that like Pinterest, Twitter, DocuSign, Twilio, now all multi-billion-dollar companies. And so I've seen a lot of waves, I guess, both as an investor, as an operator. So those are the first 2 chapters. The third chapter is really sort of the one that I'm in now. And for those that haven't read David Brooks's book, Second Mountain, I'd encourage you to read it. But you get to a point in life and you've done a lot of things for yourself to kind of bring your career and together. And then I think for most of us, it gets to a point where you get a lot more joy out of helping others. And that's really where I am. I'm very privileged to have the Canadian passport. So you're going to hear a very proud Canadian on this call today. But I'm also going to give you a little bit of perspective. So I started a nonprofit in 2008 down in Silicon Valley called C100. It was really about Canadians that had a lot of success in Silicon Valley giving back to fellow Canadians. We were very blessed to have TIE, which is the Indian global organization, Vishmitra mentor me. He was chairman of TIE globally at the time. And Shuli Guli, who was the executive director for CICC, which is the Israeli diaspora. And they were really the models of how expat communities in the Valley who had success were giving back to their country. And really privileged to have worked with them. Short version on C100, I'm not a great marketer, I'll say that out loud. What's C100? The idea was find the 100 highest potential Canadian entrepreneurs and connect them with the 100 most successful Canadians. In 2008, things were quite dire for Canada, so I'll start with that part of the story. There's an expression in Canada that is, if the United States catches a cold, Canada catches the flu economically. And that was definitely true in 2008. In more so, you could actually say that the United States had the flu. So our biggest tech giants, if you will, our flagship companies, Nortel Networks went bankrupt. BlackBerry, was on the verge of collapse. entire venture capital industry in Canada had basically almost gone to zero. If you invested in venture capital in Canada, really for the first part of the 2000s, and you gave me $1, I would give you 94 cents back after 10 years. So not really a great place to invest either. And so when we started the work that we did on C100, and I was very inspired by a woman named Orna Berry, who was the chief scientist for Israel. Orna did something really remarkable in Israel starting in 1993. She also had a pretty tough starting point in 93. Israel really had no venture capital industry, had no tech companies really to speak of, no integrated procurement. And in a very short period of time, by 1999, in 6 years, we were all saying Startup Nation like it had always been there. And that was really remarkable to me. The other thing that I observed, and then we'll kind of jump into the presentation, was I'm old enough to remember when Boston was the center of global innovation. And Boston really was the center of global innovation really till 1993, 95, that time frame. And then people started leaving for this place on the West Coast. So it really started with the migration of talented folks. And there was a bunch of reasons why Boston was struggling structurally back then, but the people started leaving in 93, 94, 95, 96. By 1997, the venture capital firms started leaving Boston and going to this place on the West Coast. And then we have this boom in the late 90s, the first internet boom. And then again, we have this place called Silicon Valley that we all think has always been there, but it hasn't. It was just, in the span of time, relatively small boom. And in about 2.5 years ago, there's some big structural changes that were happening in the world that I don't have to tell you about. But one of the things that's been written a lot about since was there's the same structural problems that Boston was experiencing in the early 90s. Silicon Valley was experiencing, actually even a bigger one that's not has not been talked about as much, which I'll jump into in a second. But the center of global innovation was moving. Wasn't clear where it was moving, but it was moving. So if you you look at that in the span of maybe just as short as 2 years ago, there's a lot of talk about, is the center of global innovation moving to Berlin? Is it moving to Lisbon? Is it moving to Singapore? Is it moving to Beijing? Is it going to, and sitting in San Francisco and having lived there for 20 years, I was thinking about this and wrote a crazy blog post now 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, about why I thought Canada was going to be the center of global innovation. So my talk is really about why I felt that and sort of what we've seen since, but it's really built on these three big changes around trust, AI, and immigration. So with that, I'm going to share my screen, see if I can do this.
Okay, we see your screen.
You got it?
Great.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these changes that we had talked about. But first of all, I want to let you know about this organization I'm very privileged to run. So I run a nonprofit called Communitech, which is centered here in Waterloo. Waterloo is now the 18th largest tech hub in North America. Very privileged to have it. University of Waterloo is, just to give you a sense of scale, University of Waterloo produces more computer science and mathematics and engineering graduates than the entire University of California system. So UCLA, UC Santa Barbara, UC Santa, all combined produce less engineers and less computer science than one university here in Waterloo. We have about 5,000 startups that we work with. $9.5 billion has been raised by those companies, a little over 6.4 billion, and 25,000 new jobs. We just crossed 30,000 tech workers. So the hub here, home of Malcolm Gladwell, we're sort of hometown proud of him. Also the hometown of BlackBerry, and now Canada's largest tech company, OpenText, which has crossed $10 billion in revenue this year. So that's a little bit about me. I'm going to pull the lens back. So I think everybody knows a version of this story, these big tech waves that happen in cycles. So I'm, of the age that I remember this stuff before the 70s, but for this crowd, I'm not going to talk about that. So we'll just start in 1970. But there's big waves that have happened. And if you look underneath those waves, like I said, Boston really was the center of everything from 1970 to really 1995. So that's a picture of Boston there in the bottom right. We had this huge wave that was driven by the internet. And so this is venture capital as sort of a proxy for density of activity and ventures that happened in San Francisco around 2000. And then it collapsed and went quite quiet for a while. And then we had this new wave that really started post 2008. And you really had three cities sort of dominate the rise of that wave. Interestingly, New York City really started to come into the fray. If you haven't been to Beijing recently, you won't recognize that second picture, but that's Beijing. A really remarkable rise of innovation and tech startups over that decade, 2010 to 20. And then the last picture is again San Francisco, still the dominant player globally. If you don't recognize that picture, that's the Salesforce Tower in San Francisco. So you had this company that did SaaS. I'd actually met Mark Benioff. His office was right beside mine, my last startup on Market Street. And I remember the day he put the little picture up that crossed off software on it. And now that's the tallest building in San Francisco, 4 blocks away from where he started that company. So a really big, remarkable wave. And if nothing had changed, you'd really probably look back and say these 3 cities for the next decade would be the dominant cities where innovation came together and happened. But something happened. And the biggest thing that happened in the United States, which I'll come back to in a second, is Trump and basically shutting off of immigration by the United States. So very, very dramatic slowdown in immigration. Just to give you a sense, the U.S. was adding around 285,000 green card holders. About half of those are highly skilled global folks. That collapsed under President Trump. This says it's related to the pandemic, but as you can see, that's kind of continued to stay low, even under the current administration. They've so conflated legal and illegal immigration in the United States that they basically shut both down. Why does that matter? Fully two-thirds of the most interesting companies in the world, and you can go back and look at this on a time series over the last 20 years, were immigrants to the United States. So if you basically say I'm cutting off 2/3 of innovation, it's a pretty massive change. The United States used to be the place where the best and the brightest could come relatively easily and build really interesting things. We can get into sort of the psychology why immigration really matters, but it really does for any country that's thinking about being a global leader in innovation. If you don't have a robust immigration framework, you really just don't have a chance for a whole bunch of reasons. If you go back from 2017 to 2008 in total capital raised, this is just giving you another sense in terms of the growth and scale between 2008 and 2017. Again, you would have expected, Beijing, Silicon Valley, Shanghai, New York, London, Boston, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, LA, Chicago to be dominating global innovation. Since 2017, almost all of those cities have cut themselves off from immigration and talent movement. And pretty much all of the Chinese cities are now blocked from a capital point of view. So it's really caused a really big seismic shift. And the question is, all right, if that's happened, where is the center mass for global innovation to go? So in case you haven't been paying attention, and haven't seen. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, NPR have been talking a lot about the tech boom here in Toronto. Sorry, is there a question?
No.
Nope. Keep going. Okay. All right. And this is really the money slide, if you will. So there are now more tech workers in Canada than there are in California. The country's, just to give you a sense of context, Canada as a country and California as a state are about the same GDP, about the same population. And so that to say that there are now more tech workers in Canada than there are in the US is one really interesting fact. The other one, and this is data that dated through 2001, the Toronto-Waterloo corridor, which is basically the same size as the Bay Area, now in 2001 had 313,000 tech workers, was the fastest growing cluster in North America. Compare that to the Bay Area of 378 and New York of 344. We're adding about 40,000 new tech workers every 12 months. The Bay Area is adding about 5,000. So we actually crossed New York to become the second largest tech hub in the world at the end of 2022. And we're on course and speed to pass the valley within 24 months. So what's driving that? There's a couple of things I don't have to tell this community about that's really driving it. If you look at some of the geopolitical issues, that's the biggest thing. For 20 years, we thought the world was flat economically, and now we've gone back to realpolitik and sort of very big seismic changes. Sadly, war in Eastern Europe, sadly, war in the Middle East, geopolitical changes in China that have basically cut it off from the globe from both an investment point of view and growth, Trump factor we talked about. But sitting behind that is the biggest wave we've ever seen from a technology point of view. So you have these conflating trends, one that's kind of shrinking the pie or changing the order of things, while just underneath the surface is this really big $15.7 trillion new market called AI, which will be the biggest technology wave that any of us have seen, including myself going back. And I lived through the building of the internet. I lived through cloud and mobile. AI is going to be about 4 to 5 times bigger. For those that aren't aware, AI was actually born at the University of Toronto. George Hinton did all of his foundational work and all of his research on AI in Toronto. That's been sort of 40 years that Canada has been investing systemically in AI as sort of a core technology. That's the reason why Jeff was and had ran the largest lab for Google. And that density of activity is also evident in the population we've been attracting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing. I'm just going to show you 4 people just to circle back on how things connect, because I think it's important to tell the story. So for those that don't know, in the middle of that Shopify picture is a gentleman by the name of Toby Luke. Toby Luke is an immigrant to Canada from Germany, wanted to figure out how to sell snowboards, got frustrated, and started a little company called Shopify. I remember meeting Toby when he was just starting that company in Ottawa just 10 years ago. It's now a $60 billion plus company by revenue, started in Canada, immigrant here. Rasha Katabi runs a company called Brim Financial, just had a massive announcement this week. She's basically the new platform Brim Financial is for all credit cards globally, just got adopted by MasterCard, immigrant to Ontario from Lebanon. The picture down below, Marcel Cortez, who runs a company called Fair. If you haven't heard about Fair, you will soon. They're basically the platform for all wholesaling globally. Just crossed $1 billion in revenue last year, based here in Waterloo. And the gentleman, Marcel's an immigrant to Ontario from Brazil. And standing beside him is Martin Bashiri, who's the platform for all education. So if you're a high school student looking to figure out where you want to go to school globally, you're probably using ApplyBoard. Now to do that, ApplyBoard also just crossed $1 billion in revenue last year. Martin Bashiri is an immigrant to Ontario from Iran. So are we sitting on our laurels in Canada? Heck no. So we came up with a crazy idea last year in the big tech layoffs. So if you remember, there were a lot of layoffs happening globally in tech last year, but one of the places it hit the most was in the United States. They have a visa for their most talented immigrants called an H-1B visa. It's a really interesting visa. It's worked very well for the United States for a long period of time. There was a big structural problem last year because the visa is basically tied to your employment. And if your employment's terminated, you have 60 days to find another job or forced out of the country. And that's okay if you're really talented and it's a normal market because you can probably find another job. But when everybody's laying off, it's really hard to do that. So I'll give you a heartbreaking story of a woman I met in Santa Clara earlier this year in May. She's from Pune. She worked very, very hard, got into Stanford, was gold medalist, so top of her class in computer science at Stanford, got her dream job as an engineer, worked at that company for 7 years, worked her way up, was a VP of engineering, single mom, 2 little kids, loved everything about her career. She was laid off from Twitter in the big layoff. She had 5 days when I met her in Santa Clara to find a new job or forced to go back to a country she hadn't been in 15 years, didn't know anybody, and none of her kids had ever been. What Canada said, look, this is the biggest handover of intellectual capital since the handover of Hong Kong in 1997. We're going to basically allow anybody in the United States who has a valid H-1B visa come to Canada and have an unlimited, not tied to your employer, work visa. So for many of these families that have been on very tenuous legal status in the United States, that have been exposed to sort of the bigger political issues in the United States, they were kind of excited to be welcomed to a country where you can bring your food, your culture, your religion, be welcomed, and have a safe place for your family and feel secure. We had a crazy idea that we could get 10,000 people to come to Canada over the year. We, from concept to launching the visa, was 4 months. And in the first 48 hours, we had 10,000 tech workers in the United States asked to come to Canada. And this was all this year, and 6,000 of those have already moved. And I'm pleased to tell you that woman from Pune is now working happily for a tech company called Cohere in Toronto. So that's one of the things I think you just have to be aggressive on talent if you're going to have success. The other thing that I think is really important, and I'm just going to spend a couple minutes on this and we can switch to questions in a little bit, is this notion of trust. In a world where big tech is not trusted out of the United States, and it's not, in a world where big tech is not trusted out of China, and it's not, Canada's brand has always been trust. There's a reason why people put that maple leaf on their backpacks when they're backpacking around the world and welcomed. Increasingly, we're seeing that as an advantage, and we've been working on this really since 2016, that trust in technology really matters. And Canada is the place where trust is built right into technologies. Our robotics companies were the first ones to sign the declaration to say that robots can't harm humans. So we have a declaration called Tech for Good, where the companies that participate, Canadian companies that participate, have to sign up to Tech for Good if they're going to be part of the community. So every one of our companies that I've been talking about are all signatories to that Tech for Good pledge. We're moving that into a Good AI Canadian standard that companies also have to adopt and publish how AI is being used transparently. We see that as most of us see that as just something we want to do in our careers. Like honestly, like when Google said we're taking away the "Don't be evil" motto, that was the first sign to me that the valley was over. Like if it was one of the great things about Google when they started it, and when they said, okay, we're going to take away the thing that we said, like we're not going to be evil anymore, like we're just not aligned with that mission statement anymore. I don't understand why they did, but they did. For Canada, I think this is a really critical piece. So with our Governor General, David Johnson, we have the Tech for Good pledge. It's available to look at and to lean into. ClearPath Robotics was one of the first companies that said, like, we're not going to create robots that harm humans. And all of our companies have aligned to that. It's part of the brand of the country, which has been great, but we're increasingly connecting that right into the methodology in which technology is developed. Just to give you a sense on growth, Canada brought in 400,000 new Canadians in the last 12 months. That's more than any G7 country or G20 country in terms of immigration flow. 50% of those folks are STEM graduates. By contrast, the United States only added 105,000 new folks. We're 1/10 the size of the United States, but doing 4 times as much immigration. It's the largest immigration since 1916 into the country, and we've have a plan that's been announced to add 500,000 new Canadians every 12 months for the next 3 years. So that'll be now 6 years in a row. So it'd be the largest growth. Right now, I just heard a really interesting stat. Downtown Toronto has 50% of the construction cranes in North America are now operating in Toronto. So a lot of growth along with that. Just to give you some, so we affectionately call, for those that are a little bit younger and know Drake, one of the great exports of Canada. So we affectionately call the Waterloo-Toronto corridor the 6. So it's about the same size as the Bay Area. So Waterloo to Toronto is a little bit shorter distance than San Jose to San Francisco. Just to give you some contrast, the 6 about 14 million people compared to the Bay Area of just under 8 million. GDP is $707 billion versus the GDP in the Bay Area of $500 billion. Tech workers I talked about, and then on tech worker growth, if the 5-year number is we've grown 44% in 5 years, so added 88,000 tech workers. The Bay Area in the same time frame added 42,000. So that's great, but remember that part I was telling you back in 2008 about how venture capital returns were not that good in Canada? Turns out that capital follows really smart people. So if you bring the smartest people around the world to come together to build things, capital follows. So Canadian venture capital returns are now actually past the United States, or actually better than the United States as of 2022. And this was a really interesting report. If you haven't seen it, this was the last report of Silicon Valley Bank that came out in February of this year. And they do a study on global innovation trends. Very, very good research. Somewhat ironically, if they had read their own research, they wouldn't have gone bankrupt. So that, put that aside as a bit of a funny. But the 2 things to take away from this slide. One is on the bottom right. I've always known that it's been more capital efficient and more cost effective because of housing, because of healthcare, and a couple of other things to grow companies in Canada. This is the first side-by-side data, Canada versus US, that SVB did, and said it was 38% more cost effective to grow a company in Canada than the United States. The one that blew me away, fell off my chair, is really the year-over-year revenue growth. If you look at that number, this is the first time in 30 years that Canadian companies for the last 5 quarters in a row have outgrown their US peers. So using 38% less money, they're outgrowing their US peers. And for me, that was a seismic change. That's like the 1995 Boston to Silicon Valley flip switch. If you can grow faster using less money, You have better access to global talent. SVB's concluding thought here is more growth, less burn in Canada. A lot more capital is going to be coming in. And in fact, we can talk a little bit about that. We went from about $1 billion a year invested in the country in 2008 to now over $17 billion. So now third behind California, New York, and Massachusetts. So you start with the people, and then capital starts to flow. To give you a sense from a global point of view, the venture capital investment in Canada is now, which is 3.5 times faster growth, is 13 times Finland, 2.5 or a little over 2.5 the investment in Germany, 4 times what's happening in Japan, 2.5 times UK, almost 12 times what's happening in Sweden. The only country that's outpunching us, and again, tip of the hat to Orna Berry, because she did a phenomenal job in the late 90s. Israel continues to execute really well on capital investment. But Canada's growing 3 times faster than all of those markets. So from a growth point of view, also driving growth. This is a little bit of a good news, bad news story from our perspective in Canada. Of that $17 billion that's been invested, fully 74% of that capital is coming from outside of the country. And the Americans have basically figured out, just like they left Boston and went to Silicon Valley, leaving Silicon Valley to invest in Canadian companies if you can grow faster using less money. Why is this a little bit of mixed news from a Canadian point of view? We just sold 57% of our best companies to the Americans in the last 12 months. So we're not sure about this one. I'll put that out there. Oops. And I think I'm about time. So I'm gonna just leave it there, and maybe we can go into some questions. But we're pretty excited about this idea of combining trust with immigration, with this fundamental shift in AI and what can be built here in Canada, and excited about the wave that's in front of us.
Chris, that was great. What a great presentation and an eye-opener of a global strategy that flows the best talent to Canada and changes the game. If you can stop presenting, we'll put talking heads on the screen so we can see each other. So
yeah, give me 1 second.
Okay. So Chris, as you mentioned this, just wanted to let you know, every one of those things that you said kind of hit on me. I am a Thai charter member. And so we're here in the Boston area. I am a fan of Boston, and also sometimes sad that we've lost so many companies to Silicon Valley as a result, even though I still believe the innovation hub is still here. And then on the other part of this thing is just the philosophy. And I put some things together. The strategy is, what's a clear criteria for selecting the smartest and the brightest? And you mentioned the H-1B visa. And that's how I got to the United States myself, through Motorola. And I was a scientist over there and a technologist. Making the country makes you feel welcome. And that was certainly the case in the United States in the 80s and 90s. There was a recognition that immigrants were very important to the nation. And then there was this thing that you didn't talk about as much, but I think was also another criteria I thought was important, was English as a language. The fact that it's universal. The Nigerian speaks to the Indian, to the Chinese, to the American in English. And so English as a language certainly makes another reason for success. And then you may want to comment on that. But there's another one which Canada has done a better job at, which the United States struggles with, and many of the European countries struggle with, is its emphasis of immigration as European versus Asian, African, Middle Eastern, which there is no limitation to brilliance. It's just who's brilliant, let's find them wherever they are.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think I'm trying to summarize your slides and what you guys have accomplished. And I thought that was brilliant in what you shared. Just that H-1B, if it's gone, will take you. And you just walk across the border and voila, you got 10,000 people who've been filtered already. The question on that first question is this. We still believe that maybe out of the 52,000 H-1B visas, there's probably about 20 who are the ones who are going to really make the big companies, the breakthrough companies. So we don't know which 20 they are, right? So you're betting on all 52,000 of them who comes with the H-1B visa. How do you know? Is this a game of chance and luck that of all the people who walk over, that some of them will be the ones, the Sergey Brins, the guys who are going to change the world, Altmans and others? What's your thought on that, on filtering because not everybody is going to start a company, and many people want to work in those companies, which is very different. Work versus creators. So first, that question: what do you think about filtering in the Waterloo area for the brilliance, the ones who actually are the big companies, will make the big companies?
Yeah, I think the short and honest answer is you just don't know. What I do know is if you're willing to pick yourself up from your home country and move thousands of miles away and take yourself away from the community that loved and raised you, that supported you, and you're willing to take that risk, there's a certain thing about those immigrants that are willing to do that. And you combine that with the fact that they're highly skilled. To be an H-1B visa holder in the U.S. and then to use that visa to come to Canada. And just to give you a sense, we're on the verge of trying to move that 10,000 a year to about 80,000 a year. So it would be roughly 15% of the 500,000 new Canadians we're bringing in will be highly skilled folks that have lived in the United States and worked there, on average 5 years. And so we're going to be able to see what they've done from a career progression. We've been very fortunate, again, to have 10,000 people apply in the first 48 hours alone. So you can imagine there's a much bigger pool that we're able to look at. And so we're trying to actually use AI in that process itself. So if we can actually find people that are moving very quickly in their careers or have startups. We also have a visa called the Startup Visa. So for founders of companies, that are choosing to relocate the headquarters of their company, that are immigrants to the United States, also bringing them in. But the short answer is you can't know for sure. But if we bring in 10,000 of the smartest people that the United States have already filtered from 400,000 of applicants in the United States, I think only 50 to 70,000 applicants get in every year. And from that pool, we're sub-selecting, another 10 to 80,000 a year. Hopefully we'll be fortunate.
So Chris, maybe a second question is, I was sad on the slide you showed of the technology and innovation across time, and you missed my company. I work for Motorola, and we were very proud. We contributed to so much in the 80s and 90s to the whole. And then we felt that each deserves to be on your slide, number one. So if you can, think about that. But the thing that I remember most about Motorola was all our senior technologists, as Motorola was struggling at different times, would leave, and they would go on to start great companies. They were the CTOs of Qualcomm. They were the CTOs at Nortel. They were everywhere. And we produced a talent pool, which was not university-based, but it was a company where you learn to build ideas into commercialization. And that created Silicon Prairie in Chicago area. Yep. We certainly, as Hewlett-Packard, contributed to Silicon Valley and all the people who left and created all the small companies around Hewlett-Packard. Are you also seeing in Waterloo that there are these companies also which will then unload talent into gaps that a company that they work for can't produce, and therefore create a whole ecosystem around those core companies that you're talking about? Is that another place that you see as a double click on that?
Yeah, no question about that. And I'll give you just two quick examples. So, and I'm also really fascinated by this dynamic because some places like Motorola, it works really well, and others it doesn't. So, if you go to India and you look at all of the CEOs that have come out and done really well, it's almost 5-to-1 Wipro alums versus Tata, right? Yep. So some companies really spawn this entrepreneurial culture within their larger businesses, and lots of leaders come out of it. My company was, you might remember, a company called Newbridge Networks that we grew from 0 to about $1.6 billion globally on the datacom side. There's 500 CEOs that have come out of Newbridge globally. Almost none that have come out of Nortel. By contrast, here in the Waterloo region, when BlackBerry collapsed, we have, you can trace almost all of our high-performing companies here have at least 2 or 3 BlackBerry execs on them. Most notably, we just had a cybersecurity company, Magnet Forensics, that just exited for $1.8 billion this year. and that was an ex-BlackBerry team. So absolutely, I think in robust innovation ecosystems, this up and down collapse through cycles also has really talented people leaving and reforming, and that's a really important part of a healthy ecosystem.
Let me touch on the next question, which was this thing about welcoming, a nation that welcomes people. I'm from Southern Africa, and we were part of the revolution of the anti-apartheid movements in the South, in Zambia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. And when you look at the United States, it was a complete beacon of freedom relative to what you saw in South Africa. And there was a sense of inclusiveness of which was going on over there. Today, that inclusiveness, certainly as you highlighted with Trump and others, certainly doesn't feel that inclusive as they narrowed down the desire for immigrants from Europe or Northern Europe particularly, right? So those kind of statements come out, which basically is somewhat makes people feel uncomfortable if they're from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, or even from Asia or Africa and other places. What is Canada doing that creates this feeling that you are more inclusive and you're more open and more welcoming? And what can other cities learn from that? Because Boston certainly still has it as a city. It's very inclusive and it's very open. But you can go miles out of Boston and you can begin to feel the Trumpism of saying, wait a second, you are not American. You don't look American, whatever that means, while somebody else who's European looks American. So those type of things are the things you see in the United States. What is Canada doing that's different that makes people feel that they are American or Canadian?
Yeah, I think there's sort of three parts of that that answer. I think the country's always really prided itself on multiculturalism. It's been a core fabric. It's very intentionally taught early on. So kids are kind of exposed to it right across the country. So to your point, like, if you look at Brexit, that was sort of a reaction to immigration in a way, more from Eastern Europe actually to England, that kind of drove the Brexit. So I do think there's an underlying economic question there too, that if the population that's been there longer feels economically disrupted, that leads to some of these issues and these tensions too. Canada's, because of the social safety net, universal healthcare, universal education, takes some of the stresses that the United States has, for example, that I think resulted either directly or indirectly in Trump getting elected, is you had a lot of people that felt very insecure about their lives, about their economic status, about their healthcare status. So Canada's done a good job of kind of making sure that the population overall feels really good and secure. I think the last piece is there's an understanding that as a country of 40 million, with a birth rate that's not replacement, I think we're 1.6 or 1.7, that for the country to be viable and to have the quality of life that we all aspire to have, we really need to kind of reinvent ourselves and really welcome all the best and the brightest from around the world. The result of that is, like, we're a very different country today than we were even 5 years ago. If you walk the streets of Toronto, which is either the third or fourth largest city in North America, fully 50% of the people walking the streets of Toronto were not born in Canada. That's a city of almost 6 million people. Half of the people walking those streets were not born in Canada. Waterloo, we very proudly just were designated the most diverse city on the planet this year. So really, proud of that. And I think, once you have those elements together, you can really proudly say, bring your best self to this place, and it will give back to you 1,000-fold. Bring your language, bring your culture, bring your religion, bring your best ideas. To your point, it's like what United States used to be. It used to be the shining light on the hill. And unfortunately, it's not that anymore. But Canada's decided, like, this is really important to us, and we're going to go all in. So, if you look at the last 12 months, I think the 4 countries, their largest new immigrants into Canada, number 1 is India, Number 2 is the United States, which is really interesting. Number 3 is Nigeria, and number 4 is Ukraine.
Perfect. This is not the target group that the United States looks at when it wants to increase its immigration right at this moment, even though that's what the demographics are showing. It doesn't desire it in many sense. So that can be the fact that you're more inclusive. Going to the what got me thinking was the fact that Shanghai, Beijing, and all those are not immigrant cities. Toronto is, but so is Dubai, and so is Singapore.
Yep.
So there are a couple of cities which look like a Waterloo or look like a Toronto to some extent, and they are beginning to beat their chest and everything else, but they haven't produced as many successful billion-dollar companies or unicorns. They're trying, and they may, but there's something about the ecosystem of a whole United States, customers, competitors, and everything else that may help refine better companies because they are competing globally and other things. So my question to you is that enough? Immigration trust and talent, or do you also need an ecosystem around it of customers and competitors?
Yeah, there's no question you need that. I think Canada sits in a very privileged position. Canada is the only G7 country that has a free trade agreement with every other G7 country. So market access is really critical. So if you want to build a global company and the G7 is half of the global market, to be able to build it out of Toronto and have access to all of those countries on a tariff-free basis has been really, really critical. Because of the CUSIC, which is the free trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, basically allows you. So if you think about this from an H-1B visa holder, that same woman that was working for Twitter in San Francisco, who's now working in Toronto with Cohere. Cohere is one of the largest innovative platform companies in the AI space. It depends on who you talk to, one of the top 4 or the top 3. She has free access from a visa point of view now as a Canadian permanent resident to work globally and have very easy access to any country she wants to go to and perform her work, and doesn't have to worry about, is she going to be allowed back in, or if her employer decides she's not working there, is her family insecure? So those combination of things are really, really important. I think Singapore is amazing what they've done there. It's a very expensive city to live in, as you know. So that may be a bit of their challenge, but some really interesting things happening there. And I'm really fascinated with what's going on in Dubai. Yeah, you're right to point that out. And I think some of the same flows of people from places like India, from Iran, as well as Ukraine and other places that are finding a new home in Dubai and building there. Very different city, something we've never seen before.
Chris, just one thought as you were talking went to my head. Another startup environment is Tel Aviv in Israel. And it fits a definition also, immigrants, because they are two, 3 generations, and they moved into Israel, and they're from Europe and other parts of the world, number 1. Smart people, good schools like Waterloo, they got good institutions. And then there's also a desire to come up with different things because there is a necessity. And they do have a common something called maybe religion or a common culture or a common background in there, along with the differences. So there's some commonalities and some differences. And does that accelerate innovation? That you have a common basic? Can it just be science? Can it just be English? Or are there other things that tie us together that allow us to exchange ideas faster, trust? And your diversity, because you're coming from multiple geographies and multiple backgrounds.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know if I've got a fully formed answer for you, but my observation was, being in the Valley for 20 years, that you were actually at an information advantage. And why is that? Not only did you have the largest critical mass of talent and the largest critical mass of capital, but literally every day in San Francisco, a team from Seoul would come through, a team from Mumbai would come through, a team from Tel Aviv would come through, And so you almost had an information advantage in terms of seeing what was happening on the globe and what was competitive. I think Canada is working very hard on establishing that same advantage via trust. That in a world where trust is going to be one of the most important things to be able to bring people together, to bring capital together, and to build big things. That foundation that we've got as a country and as a community of founders and entrepreneurs, I think, is really one of our core strengths. And I don't really see that anywhere else on the planet right now. Like I would struggle to, if you ask me, like, what's the number 2 country in trust? You know, maybe you're going to say Sweden and Stockholm. But to your point, you don't have that same diversity of the world coming together to build there. I was just in Tel Aviv earlier in May, just an amazing community, but they've got some pretty existential issues. When I was there in May, there were 500,000 tech executives and tech workers on the streets in Tel Aviv protesting their government and threatening to leave Israel. In fact, if the judiciary reforms had gone through, a good chunk of the tech community and the senior leaders were actively talking about leaving Israel. So I think there's a lot of disruption happening in the world, and Canada kind of stands alone right now as this island of relative calm and focus on building the next generation of innovative companies.
Chris, we're coming to the end of our presentation and your presentation. Maybe just I'll ask the last wrap-up question, and then you can give the last minute or the last whatever you want to summarize. The question is, Boston lost a lot of talent and companies to Silicon Valley because there was more capital there. And so they followed the money. And then those companies got really big, and many of them then still followed the money and went to New York, where Wall Street was. And therefore they relocated in the New York area. And so New York is having a boom with all these companies, which become Fortune 500 companies. And so the migration will continue, and Canada will face, you mentioned that some of your companies are being bought out by American companies, but probably I just heard Saudi Arabia is going to buy the airport at Heathrow. Heathrow Airport's up for sale. Crazy, right? But we are seeing capital talks, and people walk to the capital, right? Where the capital is. So what will be, maybe just the last question is, how do you believe you can retain these companies? Because that's what your objective is: more jobs, more growth, more happy people, innovation, cultures in your communities. How do you keep these big companies as they grow anchored and stay local, number one? And then how do you remain competitive? Because there is a country watching you, learning from you, and replicating that strategy of H-1B visas or other things. I don't know. So it's a complicated question. Sorry, you don't have a lot of time, but
so I'll try to hit it as fast as I can. But I actually think the premise is wrong. Politely, my observation is capital follows people. People don't go to capital. So actually, if you look at what happened to Boston, it wasn't that there was more money in Silicon Valley. There wasn't. There were no venture capital firms there. Actually, in fact, when the talent was leaving Boston to go to the Valley, it was in part because of things like HP and those kind of environments, but it was just a freer environment, from an entrepreneurial point of view. DEC and the large employers in Boston at the time were sucking the oxygen out of the room. The cost of hiring engineers was high. The cost of living was really high. It was lower cost and more freedom. And, if you remember, there was that whole crazy debate between West Coast offense and East Coast offense, that Boston was like too buttoned down, too unwilling to take risks, too control-minded, whereas the West Coast was more free and flowing. So it was actually the people that left in 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, and the venture firms, actually, the capital followed. And very similar, if you look at the work that Fred Wilson did in New York, really from 2005 to 2006, 2008, what he observed is young people did not want to work in research parks. They wanted to live in urban environments and have a work-life balance and quality of life. And so they were like, I don't want to work in a research park in San Jose. I want to live in downtown New York in my 20s and have a lot of fun and also build really interesting things. And so what Fred and Union Square had done a really great job of kind of cultivating and celebrating that. And that, in fact, is the thing that happened in San Francisco also in the same time frame, is that the most interesting companies, Twitter, Salesforce, Box, Dropbox, Pinterest, all left the industrial parks of San Jose, Mountain View, and decided, no, they've got to move to San Francisco to be closer to the talent. So my observation is actually everything starts with talent, and the capital will follow.
That's great. So, Chris, you got a last minute. You can wrap up with the advocacy, and at the same time, you can also make any appeal that you like, including inviting talent to Canada.
So I'll start with that. Please come. It is the most interesting place on the planet to build from. Come visit, come hang out. But if you're interested in building a company, we'd be thrilled to host you and spend time with you. I just really want to thank the community here for the opportunity to chat with you. And again, really thoughtful conversations that I've been able to observe that you've had, and I'm just thrilled to be part of that conversation. And come to Canada. It's a pretty nice place. It's a little colder right now. It's snowing outside, but it's a great place to visit. We'd be thrilled to see you.
Chris, one of the most insightful presentations this year, very provocative, and it's clearly making impact, the best talent in the world, a strategy for attracting that, and a country that's inclusive and inviting, and you're showing numbers and showing results of that. So the facts are there, the data is there, and there's also actions around this thing. So great insights for all of us. I encourage everybody to think about this for yourself, and reach out to Chris and make this real, guys. So Chris, with that, we're going to end this presentation. Thank you, everybody, for watching the GIMI Think Tank. We do this every week, and we try and bring new ideas to the table around trends on innovation, new ways to do innovation management, and what's going on in different countries around the world on innovation. Today, Chris talked about all three, but really it was about Canada and what Canada is doing to be the center of the world for innovation, entrepreneurship, and the future. With that, thank you very much. Tune in next week again. Thank you very much.
Happy holidays.